Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Aga Khan An Evening with Lecture series tonight. My name is Nasser Rabat, and I am the Aga Khan Professor and the Director of the Aga Khan Program here at MIT. Acknowledgement is a way to honor the departed, and I would like to start today's lecture with a remembrance of 4 valuable colleagues of our small AKPI community who passed away in the last month, 3 of them due to COVID-19. Here they are. Yavuz Sezer, who got his PhD here at MIT in 2016. Khalid Asfour, who got his SMArc-S at MIT in 1987 and his PhD in 1991. Jamal Abed, who got his SMArc-S in 1988 here at MIT. And Ghada Qaddoumi, who got her PhD at Harvard in 1990. May their souls rest in peace. Acknowledgement is also a step in the direction of reconciliation with our history. It is not a remedy, but just a step in that direction or in that path to reconciliation. Here goes our acknowledgement of the right of indigenous people to the land on which MIT stands. MIT acknowledges indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which MIT sits is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people connected to this land from time immemorial. Tonight's lecture is part of our series this year that explores the Islamic architectural heritage of Africa, a little research topic of great importance in the spirit of acknowledgement. We are very proud and honored to host a number of outstanding scholars who illuminate in their work the deep artistic and architectural roots of Islamic cultures in Africa. Our guest today is Professor Michel Apotsos, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Art at Williams College, and who will be speaking tonight on the lived heritage and the sacred topography of Harar Jugol in Ethiopia. I will let Courtney Leeson, a PhD candidate in the AKPI program, present Dr. Apotsos, and I will come back later to announce the next and last lecture in our series for this year. Courtney.
Thank you, Nasser. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of AKPI at MIT's 2021 Spring Lecture Series. I can't see how many people are in the lecture at the moment, but welcome everyone. It's exciting to get this off to a good start again this semester. My name is Courtney Leeson, and I'm a 5th year PhD candidate in AKPI. And tonight I have the privilege of introducing our speaker. Following the lecture, we will also have a question and answer session where all webinar attendees will be able to submit questions via the function at the bottom of the Zoom window. Michel Apotsos is Associate Professor in the Department of Art at Williams College, where she has taught courses such as African Art in the Western Museum, Architecture and Sustainability in a Global World, and Materials, Meanings, and Messages in the Arts of Africa. At Stanford University, where she earned her PhD in 2013, Apotsos' dissertation examined Afro-Islamic architecture and contemporary Islamic identity in Ghana. Before arriving at Williams, Apotsos was a research associate at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art in Washington, D.C. Her first book, based on her dissertation and published in 2016, is titled Architecture, Islam, and Identity in West Africa, Lessons from Larabanga, and examines how the built environment encodes cultural history and serves as a vehicle for identity formation in a small Muslim community in northern Ghana. Apotsos' second and most recent book project is titled The Masjid in Contemporary Islamic Africa and will be published, we will all be happy to know, this August by Cambridge University Press. I really look forward to reading it. Apotsos has also published numerous articles in journals such as African Arts, the International Journal of Islamic Architecture, Material Culture Review, and the Journal of Architectural Education. Her research interests are geographically expansive, encompassing both West Africa and East Africa, and even sometimes the country of South Africa, and thematically focused around questions of Islamic identity, Afro-Islamic architecture, and, as we will see this evening, the often contentious relationship between preserved heritage and lived culture. I first encountered Professor Apotsos' work earlier this year when a friend of mine traveled to Timbuktu and immediately messaged me, the Islamic architectural historian, with detailed questions about the mosques there. But apart from the famous Great Mosque of Jané, I knew nothing of mosque architecture in Mali. So I began searching for scholarship on Timbuktu, and I came across an article by Michel Apotsos titled "Timbuktu in Terror, Architecture and Iconoclasm in Contemporary Africa." I was struck not just by the article's title, but by the story it told of Islamic architecture, including mosques being destroyed by Islamist groups. The irony was not lost on me. But it was soon overshadowed by Professor Apotsos' beautifully woven argument. That is, paradoxically, the destruction of mosques in Timbuktu offered these tortured structures new lives. By garnering excessive national and international attention, these destroyed structures were not only completely restored, but are now considered in new light as important sites of Timbuktu's Islamic cultural heritage. I highly recommend the article to all of those interested in Timbuktu or West Africa in general. Today, Professor Apotsos will be speaking on another cosmopolitan cityscape and the social formation of cultural heritage there. Her lecture this evening is titled Lived Heritage and the Sacred Topography of Harar, Jugol, Ethiopia. Without further ado, welcome Professor Apotsos to AKPI at MIT. We're very excited to have you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you all for taking the time to come to this lecture. And I also hope that everyone has a wonderful first day of Ramadan, especially given the particularly challenging circumstances of the year. Okay, to begin with a quote from my host, Nasser Abbott has noted that the role of architecture is not only to contain and support human activity, but to function as, quote, a branch of human creativity that is relied upon to frame, embody, and preserve memories, end quote. And indeed, architecture as a medium of memory maintains multiple modes of transmitting historical narratives, recollections, and remembrances through spatial means that range from the material and the symbolic to the intellectual and the ideological. Yet history itself has never been a medium of the past. It exists completely in the present and thus actively aids in constructing the lenses through which individuals not only look back and interpret historical events, but also view present realities as they relate to these events. This also means that memory, and by association history, is rarely fixed. It can be adjusted, clarified, and even manipulated over time, and often through interpretive mediums like architecture as a mode of artifactual evidence. Such conversations inform the contemporary field of critical heritage studies, which not only focuses on how heritage space is used to represent the ideologies and agendas of the present, but also how these elements reflect ongoing relationships between history and memory, both of whom have a foot in the past while being manufactured in the present and deployed towards, to quote Laura Jane Smith, constructing, reconstructing, and negotiating a range of identities and social and cultural values and meanings in the present, end quote. To this end, the project of heritage often exists uneasily within contemporary lived environments whose dynamic realities often take history and memory and utilize them as malleable components in the creation of diverse modern identities. And this challenges the tendency of heritage to stabilize these narratives through the imposition of commemorative molds and templates that effectively embed landscapes, materials, and built forms within the fossil record of a historical imaginary that frames these stories as incontrovertibly accurate, authentic, and therefore authoritative. And such is the current situation within Harar Jugol, Ethiopia. which is the fourth holiest city in Islam, a space of one of the earliest histories of Islamic contact on the continent, and a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2006. Because of this history and the resultant architectural character of the city, Harar has in many ways been interpreted as an embodiment of the modes in which the spiritual and the cultural have been allowed to act upon and shape the contours of the lived environment. Nonetheless, Harar also exists as a contemporary dynamic urban space, pushing the thresholds of numerous conversations concerning Muslim identity in the contemporary period and how it intersects with current cultural narratives, various socio-political frontiers, and rapidly expanding technological horizons. Thus, as a topographic rendering of the ebbs and flows of societal currents over time, Harar exists in something of a liminal space between contemporary heritage rhetorics, which both celebrate and in some ways petrify its existence as a historical space of Islamic power and contact in East Africa, and its contemporary reality as a modern space that both allows and even encourages transformative readings and interpretations of its spiritual environment towards supporting and furthering diverse contemporary Muslim identities. Thus, in thinking about Harar's environment as a type of spatial cartography of the ways in which Harari Muslims have navigated the waters of their evolving cultural and spiritual condition over time, the question arises as to how rhetorics of heritage exist within this space. I would argue that in many ways, Harar's unique character moves conversations of history, memory, and legacy beyond inquiries oriented around the question, what is heritage, to consider instead whether or not a concept like heritage, as it is currently being deployed, is really the most appropriate technology for thinking about sites like Harar in the contemporary period. And this is because spaces like Harar raise important questions with regards to for whom heritage is intended to work. In other words, who are the stakeholders in this process and what is their role or claim? And how are voices represented in the various heritage narratives and policies that inform Harari space? Do all voices have equal weight, or should certain voices and agendas be privileged over others? Along these lines, does this make heritage as a process and product inherently political, in that there are strategies involved in ideas of heritage and preservation that inescapably benefit one group over another? And lastly, should heritage be allowed to die? In other words, does commemorative value necessitate an adjacent erasure towards privileging the fact that forgetting is part and parcel of the process of remembrance? So to preface this discussion, I'd like to first address the ways in which Harar's history has been spatialized within the city over time. This will enable us to appreciate the complexity of the heritage questions that exist in this space, while also offering us a mode of thinking through heritage beyond contemporary fetishizations of history and memory towards privileging a reading of Harar Jugol as an evolving spectrum of influences, ideologies, and interventions. So to begin, as previously noted, Harar Jugol is considered the fourth holiest city in Islam after Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, and its spiritual significance was foregrounded by a key moment in early Ethiopian history. So in 615 of the Common Era, the emperor of the reigning Aksum Empire of Abyssinia, which is present-day Ethiopia, at the time was Emperor al-Nagashi Ashama. And Ashama would welcome into his territory a community of Muslim refugees who were fleeing persecution from the Quraysh clan of Mecca, a group fundamentally opposed to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Emperor Ashama would take in these refugees at the request of the Prophet Muhammad, and the event itself would subsequently become known as the First Hijra, or Al-Hijra al-Ul, not to be confused with the Hijra undertaken by the Prophet himself in 622. Now, these refugees would remain in Aksum for over 20 years, and the kindness that the emperor showed to them resulted in the Prophet declaring Abyssinia Dar al-Hayed, or a space exempt from jihad or righteous conflict, saying to this end, quote, "Leave the Abyssinians as long as they leave you in peace," end quote. And many point to this initial charitable act as laying the foundation for the generally positive relationship of tolerance and acceptance that has, for the most part, existed between Ethiopian Muslim and Christian communities over time, with a handful of exceptions. So with regards to the city of Harar itself, the history of its establishment is less certain. One theory is that Harar was originally composed of 7 villages who, due to their vulnerability to natural elements and disasters, joined together to become one mutually dependent polity. Other local histories hold that Harar was established by a group of sheikhs, or religious figures, who arrived from the Arabian Peninsula in 1256 and established this site as a trading depot due to its defensibility. Yet, despite the inconclusive nature of Harar's origin story, most historians are pretty confident that the histories of Harar and Islam in Ethiopia were in many ways mutually constitutive, with Harar responding to the cultural and socio-political currents of Islam as it evolved within Abyssinian space. And these responses came to be inscribed within Harar's built landscape. So for example, between the 13th and the 16th centuries, Harar would become a major center of Islamic learning and trade in the Horn of Africa. And it was also during this time, specifically the mid-16th century, that the massive iconic walls surrounding the city would be built by Emir Nur bin Mujahid, the ruler of Harar at the time. Now, the walls that Mujahid would build were solidly composed of a combination of local stone, mud brick, and lime-based plaster, and would be interrupted at regular intervals by the addition of watchtowers at each city gate. Importantly, these infrastructures were also constructed in conjunction with a broader reorganization of the interior city streets as well into a zigzag pattern in order to thwart potential enemy invaders. And such considerations were important at the time, for although it was a period of great prosperity in Harar, it was also a time of unrest between the Muslim Sultanate of Ifat and the Christian Solomonic dynasty, which were jockeying for power within the space of the region at this time. In fact, it would be under the direction of a 16th century Somali general by the name of Ibrahim al-Ghazi, a position later assumed by Emir Mujahid, that many Ethiopian Muslims, including many Hararis, were catalyzed towards jihad in order to, quote unquote, liberate the Abyssinian Empire from Christianity's rule. And this campaign would ultimately be unsuccessful, but nonetheless, the emergent shape of Harar Jugol, as crafted by Mujahid, would gain enormous renown in the region, so much so that the emir would be recognized as a saint, and his eventual tomb would come to be seen as one of the main sources of Harar's particular spiritual charge and significance. To this end, the tomb would also be placed at the center of one of the oldest neighborhoods in the fortified city. Now, Harar's shape and religio-cultural character would continue to evolve in the centuries that followed, influenced by interreligious conflict, various European occupations that moved within and through the region in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the late 20th century incursion of the Derg regime, which would cast aside much of Ethiopia's national heritage as part of their disinclination towards supporting the nation's historical past. Yet a subsequent coup in the early 90s and the major socio-political and cultural shifts that followed over the past 3 decades have prompted a significant resurgence of investment in the nation's heritage, as well as support for its diverse cultural and spiritual communities. Both Christianity and Islam now enjoy equal constitutional positions and protections under Ethiopian law, and many of the prohibitions on religious activities and press freedoms established by the Derg have been lifted in the past 2 decades. This brings us to a discussion of Harar's current architectural character, which has again functioned as both a product and a producer of Harari identity and reality over the space of its history. And importantly as well, some of its most notable structural genres, particularly its walls, its shrines, and its mosques, have collectively come to create a landscape that reflects a spatial collaboration between the city's cultural identity and its spiritual histories as an evolving architectural ecology. So to begin with the aforementioned walls, which were built by Emir Nur bin Mujahid, Harar Jugol is Ethiopia's only walled city. The term Jugol itself, in actuality, refers to both the walls themselves and the area it encloses. Having an area of around 48 acres, many have said that Harar's Islamic identity begins with its walls. And this is because the walls maintain a number of symbolic elements that enable them to bestow spiritual and symbolic charge onto the city's interior space. So for one, the walls are constructed according to the Abjad system of mathematics, which is a system that assigns numerical values for each of the 28 letters of the Arabic alphabet. This enabled the length of the wall, which is measured at 6,666 cubits, a cubit being the length of one's forearm, to correspond to the letter Mim of the Arabic alphabet in reference to the Prophet Muhammad as a mode of eliciting barakah or blessing. In addition, the walls themselves were originally pierced by 5 gates or baris, corresponding to the 5 primary avenues extending from the central point of the city. And the number 5, of course, has spiritual significance as both a reference to the 5 pillars of Islam and the fingers of the hand of Fatima. Emphasizing this further, a saint's tomb was placed in the vicinity of each gate as a way to enable further spiritual protection of the town by providing a preemptive layer of sanctity through which one must pass before entering into the interior space. It should also be noted that a 6th gate, here seen in the upper central image, was actually added by the 20th century Emperor Haile Selassie as a quote-unquote car-friendly entrance into the city. But along these lines, these walls also importantly bring the concept of boundary into play here, and that these ramparts not only act as mediators between exterior and interior, but also between city and country, and one could argue spiritual and secular space. This function has also been emphasized by the fact that historically polluting materials, including the dead, water, which was considered noxious, trash and rubbish, and bodily excrement were left outside the city walls each night, with rubbish dumps often located right outside of the gates themselves. Following this, the wall and gate system of Harar also created a contained spiritual element that encouraged the development and differentiation of adjacent secular areas, like so-called New Harar, which has over the past century and a half grown up along the outskirts of the old city towards accommodating for prohibited or haram materials and activities not acceptable within Harar's sacred space. And I will be addressing New Harar shortly. Thus, the walls of Harar Jugol do not simply define the town as a protected area, but also as a spiritual space as well, that when one enters is subsequently fractalized into a series of subspaces that each add to the broader religio-cultural imprint of the city through their own unique spatial characteristics. So one such subgenre of spiritual space within Harar are the city's shrines, which have achieved great spiritual and architectural heights within Harar's space and are oriented around the veneration of saints or walis who act as both mediators and intercessors for the faithful through their possession and distribution of blessing. Importantly as well, these shrines also function as commemorative apparatuses and constitute a spatial practice that involves a continuous revitalization of history through the process of remembrance that occurs at regular intervals at these sites, even into the contemporary period. Now, because of its shrine culture, for lack of a better descriptor, Harar has been described as a hub of Muslim saints. In fact, the city itself is often considered one large shrine, with one, in essence, stepping onto holy ground. The second one passes through the gates. And within the city itself, the shrines collectively form an organizational system that, in conjunction with mosques, which will be addressed shortly, generate a larger spiritual overlay within the walled space. Now, the process of shrine creation begins with the death of a sheikh, or a religious leader in the community. Sheikhs are largely considered to be impeccable in their piety, and because of this are able to perform numerous miraculous acts and notable deeds within society. And at the time of their death, graves are constructed for them by their followers, usually within the spaces with which they are most associated. So this could be under a tree where they used to teach, such as that of Sheikh Abida, one of the only female saints within the city, or in a clearing. But with the construction of this tomb space, these sites are subsequently considered to be protective mechanisms for the city. But again, these shrines also act as a type of mnemonic device for followers who continuously visit and thus animate the site through their performative spirituality, which reaffirms the site's religious charge as well as the follower's spiritual path. Now, although the number of shrines present in Harar seems to vacillate depending on the source, Harar's Cultural Heritage Bureau states that there are currently 438 identified shrines existing both inside and outside the walls of the city. And the shrines themselves come in a variety of forms, ranging from natural elements such as trees and rocks to dome structures that typically range between 3 and 6 meters in height. Some scholars have speculated actually that the use of natural objects to mark these spiritual sites is pre-Islamic in origin, potentially referencing the assimilation and repurposing of early Kushite cult practices by incoming Islamic adherents. But with regards to these structural forms, they are usually painted green or sometimes white with green piping, which are both colors symbolic of the faith. They also typically contain a small door, no more than 1 meter high on average, that forces an adherent to bend when entering, which acts as a reminder that humility is a virtue. Importantly as well, these structures often blend in with the general landscape of the city, both in terms of the materials used, which include local stone, lime, and a specific type of rot-resistant local wood called Darby Inchi, which is also used to build the houses and other structures in the city, as well as their formal elements. And this again emphasizes the intimate, physical, and spiritual relationship that exists between the shrines and the city as a collective, broad-based spiritual terrain. I should also note that some shrines are literally embedded within the exterior walls of homes, which we see here in the upper right-hand image. You see this is a shrine structure that has quite literally been physically incorporated into a domestic space, which again actively emphasizes this inextricable relationship. Now, these shrines also maintain a degree of individual character that is largely connected to the particular type of spiritual power that the interred sheikh was associated with, and that has subsequently come to infuse the site as well. So, the tomb of Emir Nur bin Mujahid, again, the commissioner of Harar's wall, for example, is covered with 99 stones that not only act as scaffolding for the annual painting of the shrine dome, which occurs at most shrines and houses every year just before Ramadan, but also references the 99 names of Allah. Interestingly, there is also a burial place in this tomb's complex for Mujahid's horse, which allows the site to not only gesture towards his spiritual capacity, but also his military role as a 16th century warrior in the jihad against the Solomonic dynasty. Now, within the shrine itself, one finds further evidence of his spiritual and political life. In it lays his tomb, which rests on a wooden scaffolding that resembles a bed and is covered with a green cloth inscribed with Quranic inscriptions and identification information. Over this grave hangs 2 ostrich eggs that are attached to the ceiling and act as a mode of preventing erosion by channeling water from the ceiling as it drips. In addition, these eggs also act as a symbolic gesture towards the prosperity that Mujahid brought to the city. The interior also holds, probably one of its more interesting aspects, also holds a glass vitrine that contains ropes that the emir owned, as well as a set of whips that in Harari tradition had the dual role of animal control, so the emir would have undoubtedly used them for his horse, as well as spiritual cleansing, and that it was thought that if one was possessed, being whipped would expel the evil within through the tears that one would shed throughout the process. This practice is no longer followed, although the whips are still kept as spiritual and cultural artifacts. The emir's sword also previously resided in the shrine, but has since been removed to Harar's National Museum. Within the shrine, however, it is apparent that various secular and cultural objects have come to assume the status of sacred relics, memorial remnants that have attained blessing within the context of this holy space. And in this way, the emir's power is made manifest not only as a religious figure, but also as a political and a historical figure as well, with the shrine subsequently coming to act not only as a religious text, but also a commemorative document deeply embedded in Harar's history and identity. Yet not all shrines in Harar are so carefully maintained and celebrated. There are also a number of shrines in the city that have begun to slide out of physical and memorial existence, save for a few individuals who might have passing knowledge of their presence and purpose. Such shrines are often not marked, or if there are markers, they are somewhat obscure and generally considered not worthy of note, at least by the various cultural heritage bureaus. So the shrine of Sharif al-Hassan, for example, exists as a concrete lump in the middle of a small thoroughfare on the south side of town. Having no complex or prayer hall, the shrine is largely unremarkable, save its rather strange presence in the middle of the road. It contains a small hole at the bottom for the insertion of incense, but in no other way, shape, or form is truly differentiated from its surrounding landscape, a lack of separation that has given it a somewhat mundane, anonymous quality. And the general neglected state of the shrine in many ways may reflect a similar condition with regards to Sharif al-Hassan himself. When asked about his identity and contributions to the city, most area residents either couldn't say or gestured vaguely to his sheikh status. Yet such structures, anonymous as they may be or may be becoming, continue to contribute in their own way to the composite spirituality and collective religious cartography that defines the spatial nature of Harar. Each one represents a legible architectural vocabulary, this domed, painted form that, regardless of its memorial amnesia, gestures to the role that the relationship between Islam and historical personages play in the formation of Harar's unique identity. As such, these structures contain a type of wisdom based on experience that, despite a potential lack of architectural assertiveness and a rather slow erasure over time, continues to act as a catalyst for the broader spiritual and cultural memory of Harar, and importantly, does not fix these connotations within a rigid memorial structure. Instead, it consciously responds to and is continuously supportive of evolving functions and meanings. And this makes it so that within the context of the shrines of Harar Jugol as a collective landscape, the individual, to quote Rabat again, can make them his or her own architecture, the milieu of his or her own memories, while they retain their initial role as the repository of collective meanings and memories, end quote. Thus, Harar's shrines, both as individuals and a collective spiritual landscape, catalyze both past and present realities. Now, such functions also find representation in Harar's mosque spaces, with the city said to have the world's highest concentration of mosques, earning it the rather glib title of Africa's Mecca. Although, like the shrines, the number of mosques vary depending on the source, the official number of mosques within the walls of Harar Jugol is 82, each cited to accommodate around 40 households, although many of these mosques are owned by families and typically are only visited by their members. It is also commonly believed within the city that building a mosque ensures one's admission into heaven, and thus it is a process that has over time been undertaken with great enthusiasm and dedication. Now, the mosques of Harar range in both size and population, from small familial mosques to the large iconic jami or congregational mosques whose minarets rise above the city skyline like pins on a map. Yet despite their almost overwhelming number and variety, these mosques nonetheless actively contribute to the structural harmony that generally characterizes the city's urban fabric via their democratic sprawl across the landscape. Now, with regards to the large congregational mosques, many constitute urban landmarks within the city space. So the Den Agabara Mosque, for example, which is also known as the Grand Jami Mosque, is a large 16th century structure that is located in the central space of the town and has seen multiple renovations and alterations over its long life. The mosque itself is a two-story structure with both the lower and upper stories defined by a series of embellished horseshoe arches and foregrounded by a large rectangular courtyard and ablution station. And during congregational prayers on Friday, the mosque space expands to fill the street out in front of it, effectively extending sacred space in a way that reorients the entire flow of movement and attention within the city center to privilege and reaffirm the fundamental Islamic character of the city through the temporary but impactful occupation of public space. Yet such structures also share space with smaller, less proclamative mosque sites that are often only recognizable by the presence of loudspeakers perched often precariously on the rooftops or the bright green plaques adorning their doors. These plaques typically have the name of the owner of the mosque on them, as well as the number assigned to them by Harar's regional tourism office. One might also occasionally see a small minaret or cluster of minarets and a niche form on the exterior wall indicating the Qibla. But with regards to these structures, they operate oftentimes anonymously within a neighborhood space. Such mosques are often stumbled upon while wandering through the labyrinthine areas of the city, off the primary thoroughfares, and are woven seamlessly into the general structural fabric of the area. Some of these mosques are connected to saint tombs and therefore not only act as spaces for daily prayer, but also spaces of veneration, pilgrimage, and various ceremonial cycles throughout the year. Others are more introverted and oriented towards the family that owns them. Sometimes these mosques are even located within the family compound itself, the compound courtyard acting in a dual capacity as a family space in addition to an area for ablutions and preparation for prayer within the mosque space itself. Most of these spaces are also extremely small in size. In fact, many require visitors to duck when entering, an activity that again gestures to the necessity of coming to God in a humble manner. And typically, such spaces are composed of one prayer room with a small courtyard for ablutions and a staircase leading to the rooftop for the adhan or the call to prayer. On the interior, many of these spaces have nooks and niches where Qurans, candles, and other paraphernalia are kept, as well as spaces for shoes and extra prayer mats. In many cases, these mosques also contain nabada, or raised seating platforms or benches where students and elders can sit and discuss various religious matters. Now, while the interiors of these spaces have tended to remain the same over the years, many of the exteriors, however, have been used to celebrate trends within the city regarding appearance and material. So while most mosque exteriors are painted green in reference to its relevance in Islamic tradition, the many shades of green that now grace the surfaces of Harar's mosques range from deep forest green to almost neon green in color. In addition, color schemes often shift as Ramadan draws closer, and beautification very much becomes the order of the day. As such, colors beyond green, especially those that are new and innovative within the environment, are often introduced. One such structure recently utilized a particularly eye-watering shade of flamboyant purple, which apparently raised some eyebrows within the community. And in some cases, paint has also been used to draw architectural details on the walls, including various structural and decorative iconographies such as arch forms, which not only connect these spaces to other spiritual sites like the Jami Mosque, but also gesture towards the function of these spaces as being fundamentally spiritually oriented, a two-dimensional complement to other three-dimensional markers like the minaret. But like the shrines, many of these mosques are also memorial in nature. Many of them are named after their creators, whereas others are named after famous Harari personages, religious figures, emirs, etc., as a way to actively remind contemporary Harari inhabitants not only of the history of these figures and their importance in the community, but also the important spiritual role that Harar as a whole plays within the wider global Islamicate. Thus, in considering Harar Jugol's landscape as a comprehensive religio-cultural topography, it stands as an environment fundamentally geared towards keeping memory and identity animate within the landscape, using spatial means and apparatuses to establish a sense of legacy. And this legacy has been at the center of contemporary heritage discussions currently circulating within Harar's cultural and religious space. Harar was officially recognized as a national heritage site by the Ethiopian government in 1974, with identified sites of interest being, quote, principal monuments, important historic buildings, contextual urban fabric, and out of context buildings, end quote, according to the city's management plan. Following this, Harar was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2006 for meeting these particular criteria. First, it, quote, exhibits an important interchange of values of original Islamic culture expressed in the social and cultural development of the city, end quote. Second, it, quote, bears exceptional testimony to the cultural traditions related to Islamic and African roots, end quote. Third, it represents, quote, an outstanding example of a type of architectural and urban ensemble which illustrates the impact of African and Islamic traditions on the development of specific building types, end quote. And finally, it represents, quote, an outstanding example of a traditional human settlement representative of cultural interaction with the environment, end quote. Now, much of the preservation activity with regards to Harar has been primarily implemented through the UK-based Center for Research and Conservation of Cultural Heritage and the Harar-based Harar Jugol Heritage Conservation Office. And these activities have been generally oriented around the structural components of Harar Jugol, with the stated goal of only making changes when necessary to increase quality of life, while not disturbing the fundamental framework of the buildings themselves. This has included restoring elements of the physical setting when they degrade, repurposing existing physical elements for new functions to keep them relevant, and maintaining structures as close to their original condition as possible. So this, in conjunction with the development of heritage and museum spaces, including the Harari National Museum in 1977, the Harar Jugol Ethnographic Museum in 1979, and the Sharif Harar City Museum, which was established by private citizen Mr. Abdullahi Ali Sharif in his home in 1983, have collectively generated a type of exhibitionary aesthetic within Harar, whose goal has been, to quote anthropologist Camilla Gibb, quote, to make interpretations of history a part of daily life, and to enable citizens to be reminded every day of their shared history in these particular terms, end quote. Thus, the spiritual infrastructures of Harar have in many ways been collectively collapsed into a somewhat singular interpretive rendering of a complete Islamic urban landscape, an occurrence supported by a number of Harari citizens who feel that preserving the old city is indeed a part of their cultural and spiritual mandate. Many of these citizens reference Quranic injunctions to not only restore, but also preserve and maintain spaces of spirituality and worship. And there is also the fact that older spiritual spaces are often held in higher esteem than newer spiritual spaces because they existed closer to the time of the prophet and are thus perceived to be better or holier. Such readings, of course, position the architectural infrastructures of Harar as fundamental cogs in the spiritual machinery of the city as a type of collective shrine. Yet questions arise, specifically concerning how Harar's heritage should be represented and issues of equity and agency therein. So, for example, there is developing tension between community members and representatives of the aforementioned heritage institutions, particularly UNESCO, with regards to material usage, visual appearance, and issues of perceived authenticity relating to city structures. So along these lines, many of the traditional wooden doors used in Harar's architectural infrastructures are now being replaced by metal doors as a function of cost. In addition, the many colors now used to paint the interior or the exterior walls of Harari structures is generating consternation among an older generation with regards to their appropriateness in representing Harari culture and religious identity. But others also push back on these views, resisting what they see as their transformation into living actors playing on a heritage dictated stage set, a reality that is furthered by Harar's current moniker as a quote, living museum where the past embraces the present, end quote, from Harar's Tourist Bureau. This title is, of course, redolent with traces of ethnographic presentness, which have also been noted in other UNESCO inscribed sites, including the town and Great Mosque of Jenne in Mali and Zanzibar's stone town off the coast of Tanzania. One could also point to the fact that the many objects that currently stock Harar's museums have not only come from domestic and public spaces, but also from shrine spaces themselves. While no one has expressed direct resentment at these removals, it does represent a certain fragmentation of the spiritual narrative behind some of these sites and begs the question of what happens to Harar as a shrine space if its spiritual sites not only become fragmented, but these fragments are subsequently reconstituted within the largely secular heritage-laden space of the museum. Yet beyond these largely material concerns, there are also questions of the accuracy of positioning Harar's heritage narrative within the framework of an idealized Islamic urban space. Not only does Harar maintain a small but dedicated Christian minority with their own spaces of worship within the community, but in more recent years, worshipers of other faiths have increasingly begun traversing Harar's boundaries to utilize the city's most sacred spaces as universal rather than strictly Muslim spiritual sites. Women who identify as both Christian and Judaic can be found praying at various Islamic shrines within the city walls for help with things like pregnancy. And members of multiple faiths visit the area to participate in the week-long festivals that occur on an annual basis around various shrines in the city, with Christians leaving only to attend Sunday service at their own church. And this speaks to the largely accepted fact that once within Harar's spiritual space, borders between faiths are erased as one is absorbed into the universal spiritual sanctity of the city. In fact, the custodian of one of the city's most important shrines, the founder of the city, Sheikh Abidar Umar al-Rada, had this to say about the multitude of different types of worshipers that visit his shrine. Quote, Abadir is the father of us all. He does not distinguish between nationalities and religions. Boundaries between followers don't make sense because there are Christians who are Muslims at heart and there are Muslims who are Christians. The only importance is that you are pure. Allah knows you, and on the final day of judgment, you will be separated. As human beings, we are not capable of marking difference by ourselves, end quote. So this positions Harar as not only a collective space of veneration, but also a multivalent spiritual terrain whose spirituality is read through the lens of one's own belief system and whose spiritual applications are, quote, flexible, absorbent, and heterogeneous, according to Gibb, end quote, which challenges the rather narrow conceptualization of Harar as a rigidly denominational space. Perhaps one of the most pressing concerns with regards to Harar's legacy, however, is not pressure coming from the interior of the city, but the exterior. Overcrowding, congestion, and pollution are symptomatic of the broader collision currently occurring between the old city of Harar Jugol and the development of a modern new Harar outside Jugol's walls. Increasingly obscuring the older city behind a rising skyline of buildings, Harar's new space not only illustrates the binary that has been firmly established between heritage's need to conserve and the city's need to adapt, but also how the layered nature of this city and the constant push and pull between preservation and evolution affects the performance of cultural and spiritual life within this space. Many Harari youth are increasingly going abroad to places like Canada for economic or educational reasons and are returning with money to invest in infrastructure, which has given them a rather ambivalent attitude towards the older city. This ambivalence has also been heightened by the growth of a type of class-based bias with quote unquote old section inhabitants viewing themselves as more authentically Harari than other members of the community, particularly those living outside Old Town. And this, interestingly, has also raised concerns with regards to whether Harar Jugol's physical boundaries and the form of its iconic walls have come to function as more than a sign of spiritual power in transition. Now they have come to also represent an obstacle preventing potentially constructive dialogue between an older generation and a new one that is increasingly attracted to a more modern way of life. Thus, although heritage by its nature is an inherently fluid construct, questions remain with regards to how contemporary heritage philosophies can accommodate the dynamic legacy of Harar Jugol, a city that continues to experience dramatic shifts in meaning and relevance as a result of ongoing negotiations about how it exists within the contemporary world. And this situation feels particularly pressing, given that these negotiations have over time resulted in a very literal rending of the urban fabric of the city into two distinct communities. This continuous, contentious reimagining of Harar's fundamental sense of self means that while heritage as an idea operates as a noun, the cultural and spiritual identities of Harar Jugol very much require it to function as a verb, an active representation, in other words, of ongoing discussions between the city's sites and traditions and its contemporary realities and identities. It should also be noted that Harar's condition is not unusual or unprecedented. It is in fact reflective of the experiences of a number of historical environments currently navigating various heritage conflicts and whose stakeholders are engaged in a constant struggle for control over the historical narrative of an area. This in turn frames heritage as, quote, a struggle over power, according to Laura Jane Smith, because heritage is itself a political resource, end quote. And this begs the subsequent question of whether Harar can continue to maintain a localized sense of self within its established physical and symbolic ramparts while navigating a path forward into the future. As a spatial apparatus through which Harari citizens have, over time and space, engaged in continuous, purposeful representations and renovations of their own histories and memories, the city of Harar not only illustrates an innovative combination of stasis and change, but also highlights the reality of history as the porous, strategically engineered container that it is, while also underscoring a fundamental flaw in heritage as fundamentally tethered to this often artificially demarcated terrain. And thus the final question to ask here is whether certain spaces should be allowed to die and transition into a type of cultural and spiritual afterlife. This is a question against which heritage is in constant tension. The possibility of death, or even worse, erasure from memory, often feels antithetical to the quote unquote memory burden, to use James Young's concept, that heritage is expected to shoulder. Yet with regards to Harar Jugol's architectural heritage, I would say that in many ways, such processes are and have long been inherent mechanisms within the city's built environment, actively representing processes of remembering and forgetting as part of a natural selection process through which sites are either deemed effective or less effective as spaces of collective memory. Thus, the evolution of Harar's landscape over time has been a process in which certain sites and structures have faded in and out of focus and consciousness towards enabling the built environment to remain in tune with its community as a sign of spiritual and cultural health. And through its ability to evolve, renovate, and renew through a process of architectural molting, as it were, the particular structures deemed fundamental anchors to the spiritual and cultural identity of Harar are recognized as such through their physical presence and the rituals, performances, behaviors, and practices that they continue to catalyze. Thus, Harar, as a space layered with a thick patina of historical and spiritual resonance, nonetheless continues to keep a finger on the pulse of contemporary Islamic existence, maintaining a mobile, flexible, and above all, metabolic nature that has enabled its citizens to act as the protagonist of their own cultural and spiritual narratives and participate in local and global modes of self-fashioning through spatial and architectural interventions within the city space. And so to conclude, Harar as a space illustrates the dynamic but selective nature of architecture and by association heritage as a process of remembering, forgetting, and selective assimilation, which in turn positions Harar not only as a space of spiritual practice and identity, but, to quote Kishwar Rizvi, simultaneously a memorial to the past and an aspiration towards what is to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm not sure we have the clap function on this webinar, but thank you so much. That was a lovely talk. I'm going to be accepting questions from the Q&A section at the bottom. So if anybody has any questions, you can click down there and then they will then pop up for me. I'm not sure that everyone else can see them, but I'll be able to read them aloud. Thank you again. I had a sort of, maybe it's not a fully formed question yet, but I would very much like to hear more about how you sort of describe Harar Jugol as itself a full shrine made possible by these walls that encompass the city. And I was wondering, are there, I guess, what is the relationship between the shrines inside of the city and maybe non-urban shrines in this region? Is there sort of an absence of that allows Harar Jugol to then be a shrine itself for the larger region? Or is perhaps in a different area in Ethiopia, are there more maybe rural shrines? I guess that's sort of my question.
Yeah, so Ethiopia as a broad space is very interesting because of its essentially its countrywide shrine culture. And what's interesting about kind of the shrines writ large in Ethiopia is they're not just oriented around Islam. There are a number of Christian shrines because obviously Christianity is a huge component of kind of Ethiopia's religious identity. There are also a number of Judaic shrines as well. And so Ethiopia, broadly speaking, has a huge kind of organizational shrine cartography, for lack of a better word, with shrines existing in urban spaces, rural spaces, existing as rocks, trees, mountains, while also sometimes existing as these broad architectural superstructures that are almost kind of monasterial in appearance. There are some shrines that actually have kind of convent-based residence halls where people actually come and learn and meditate, with regards to their particular faith. What's interesting about Harar Jugol is not only kind of the kind of architectural specificity of the space and that it's enclosed, it's contained, it represents in some ways almost an object as much as it is a landscape. And on top of that, because of kind of the directed, targeted nature of its religious and architectural development, really gives her, well, because of its walls. Also, I should also note that, kind of walled Islamic cities are kind of an iconic architectural, kind of an iconic architectural iteration. And so the walls act as kind of a mode of signifying or representing kind of this particular identity. And on top of that, the way that these shrines exist not as kind of these independent entities, but in conversation with one another within a space, to the point where when people come to Harar to engage in a type of pilgrimage, there's kind of an organizational path that they can follow throughout. It's in some ways it's somewhat similar to Timbuktu in that there actually is kind of a path that one follows with regards to kind of encountering shrines, encountering the various saints that are represented by these shrines, and kind of partaking in the spiritual resonance of each shrine as a process of procession. And so there are a number of kind of different specific characteristics with regards to Harar that have really kind of elevated it above kind of the general shrine context as a very kind of special, spiritually resonant space. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. I see that Nelser has a question, and I'll just let him ask it himself since he's on the screen. And then I'll go back to the Q&A boxes for the next one.
Thank you. And thank you, Michelle. I raised my hand simply because I couldn't figure out how to type my question. So it's not that I'm trying to take advantage of my privilege. It's just that I don't have the technology to be able to perhaps actually follow what I was supposed to. Michelle, it's a very specific question because I'm reading your lecture in light of an understanding of heritage that is on a spectrum, or actually dealing with heritage on a spectrum of interventions, starting from, I don't know, sort of like the honoring of the heritage in preservation, conservation, and so on. And you're allowing us to move all the way to permitting heritage to disappear. Either because we are removing it in order to move on with the current life, or because it basically dies, like a John Ruskin notion of how heritage is supposed to be allowed to die. So my question is specifically about where would you locate in this spectrum the musification of objects that are taken from shrines and mosques and put in a museum? How does the museum fit within this larger spectrum of heritage conservation, or basically dealing with the heritage in general? Thank you.
Well, that's a really good question. And, you know, it becomes particularly interesting when looking at her Jugol, which, you know, exist as kind of an assemblage of not only different sites, but also different objects, different spaces, different people. And thus, kind of as this collaborative environment, I particularly find some of the fragmentation, some of the removal of objects that in so many ways constitute kind of a fundamental part of the whole with regards to kind of the spiritual identity of a particular site. To me, it seems to be, well, let me actually, okay, I'm gonna make kind of an off-topic comparison. When one thinks about masquerade practice in West Africa, for example, when one sees components of it in a museum, one is typically treated to the face mask, right? Largely because the face mask constitutes kind of the closest thing in kind of Western art historical tradition to an art object. Now, the problem with this mask, though, is that it was never meant to exist independently, right? It was meant to be part of a larger ensemble composed of costuming, potentially face paint, performance, music, sighting, light. All of these elements are absolutely key towards creating an animate presence, with this mask being one particular part of it. And thus, by privileging this one aspect, so much of the importance and relevance of the practice as a whole, in many ways, is elided. And so, in some ways, and granted, I'm sure there are people who probably don't agree with me, in some ways, I see museums as being kind of special and also specially distant. And that so rarely are they able to privilege the entirety of the experience, so much of which is necessary to gain a true kind of appreciation for what you're seeing. But also that in many cases, it tends to elevate some objects inappropriately of others. It tends to deny kind of the collaborative element that so often exists with these objects, especially objects that have particular spiritual resonance. And you know, within Harar, it's a little different because some of these museums are actually still located in Harar, so it's not like they're out of the city. But at the same time, when one is meant to experience and interact with a site, So many of these individual objects are used to create kind of a collaborative experience, a collaborative whole that enables one to really kind of access the particular spiritual power of the site. And so I mean, and again, I say this as someone who was only a guest in the space. And so, you know, I'm sure people are probably, you know, fairly understanding with regards to kind of these objects being able to exist in multiple spaces. I see it as engaging in a potential type of fragmentation that might be problematic.
Thank you. The next question is about whether or not you see Harar Jugol as representative of the sort of the same kinds of heritage challenges that we see in the global south, and how that might be different from heritage challenges that we see in what would be the global north.
So the answer is yes, especially when it comes to kind of global institutional bodies like UNESCO. You know, one interesting thing about UNESCO is that until recently, potentially maybe a decade or two ago, I'd say about 70 to 80% of UNESCO World Heritage sites were actually located in the so-called global north. And then kind of the recognition of this inequity, you know, created kind of this surge of UNESCO heritage sites in the so-called global south. The interesting thing about how heritage is treated in spaces like this is that so often kind of local stakeholders and actors are often in some ways their voices aren't necessarily privileged in some of the decision-making processes that occur. So Jene is a great example in the sense that, you know, it's been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since the late 80s. And so both the mosque and certain areas of the town were preserved. But with this preservation came limitations on what people could do to their own homes. They couldn't expand them. They couldn't install modern sewage systems or electricity. They couldn't use cement. And so because of this, you know, obviously, and oftentimes people actually didn't find out about these limitations until they actually tried to do some of these renovations. And it created enormous problems with regards to equity and, you know, the idea that stakeholders who were fundamentally, you know, affected by a lot of these decisions were also fundamentally excluded from the decision-making process. And in an ironic twist, Jene also developed kind of a new Jene off to the side outside of Jene's traditional settlement. So, you know, it's interesting to see not only similar types of kind of heritage inequities going on, but also similar types of responses to some of these inequities as well.
Thank you. I have quite a few questions, but I'll start with one quick one. One person asked, or maybe it was more of a comment, but asking sort of how the walled old town could survive through all of this with tourism. Is tourism sort of a way to help preservation in this case and to support preservation? Or in this case, is it sort of also perhaps destructive?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I mean, tourism is one of these double-edged swords, right? On the one hand, it brings in, you know, obviously economic interest. On the other hand, it also, you know, I mean, by generating some of these, you know, economic advantages, you know, that in turn kind of propagates more attention and maintenance with regards to some of these structures that are bringing people in. You know, conversely, tourism also requires infrastructure. You know, currently there is one gate that can actually allow like a decent sized car to go into Harar Jugol, but cars are often backed up going into this gate for, you know, a good half mile down the road pretty much all day. On top of that, just excessive amounts of pollution is actually causing some of the walls to disintegrate in a in a very quick fashion that is increasingly creating problems with regards to people's ability to kind of actively preserve, to keep kind of time with the actual destruction. And on top of that, you know, I mean, a lot of tourists also come in somewhat unaware of the particular kind of cultural and spiritual traditions of the area, and thus want, you know, certain experiences that are not necessarily prohibited or that have been traditionally prohibited within the walled space, but you know, are since kind of being relaxed a little bit. So for example, when I was there a couple of years ago, I actually saw 1 or 2 bars within the walled city, which of course is generally haram, but as a way to, again, accommodate tourists who are giving a lot toward the local economy, sometimes these concessions are being considered. So.
Thank you. I have a question from Sarah Berriman about how you think perhaps are there any sort of strict, I guess, steps that we could take to help to preserve this architecture? Do you see any tangible steps that UNESCO or other governing bodies are not taking at this time that perhaps could be taken?
Well, I think one of the biggest problems to this situation, and this goes back to kind of the stakeholder discussion, is that so often the decisions that are made kind of in the interest of the infrastructure rather than the individuals who live within it. So right now, Harar Jugol as a space is completely full. No new construction is allowed. The only type of construction that is allowed in the walled city are kind of these renovation projects that are, okay, I'm sorry, I'm reading that there were actually mini bars. Okay, all right, so yes, so bars apparently have long been excuse me, I'm distracted, have long been a part of the walled city. With regards to heritage, I think what is really necessary is not so much specific kind of infrastructure-based projects designed to preserve, but what I think needs to happen is the conversation needs to accommodate a larger stakeholder body so that it's not just UNESCO or even the Harari Cultural Bureau kind of imposing these goals onto the population, but that the conversation includes kind of these larger institutional stakeholders, as well as the individuals who are directly involved in kind of existing within these spaces. And generally speaking, I will say from the people that I talk to, the Harari community is very much behind kind of the preservation projects that have gone on. But at the same time, there is also a very different group that is also existing within this walled city, but also exterior to it, that really kind of sees some of these guidelines as needlessly limiting and not allowing the community to really be in tune with some of the developments that are going on outside the walls. And some people are actually really nervous that this will lead to some of Harar's kind of spiritual identity eventually becoming obsolete, not necessarily as a heritage site, but as a space of spiritual power that people come to regularly during, pilgrimages that, people celebrate, and that, the people who derive a lot of their spiritual identity from this space.
Do you see the change in the color, sort of the adaptation of the fuchsia and the orange as sort of a nod in that direction of sort of aestheticizing this as a cultural space and not as a spiritual space?
Well,
you see that shift maybe now, or?
So my understanding is that the trend of creating kind of these beautifully kind of eye-popping structures has always been a component of the space. What's different is now there are just kind of these modern industrial paints that really enable these truly kind of eye-watering bright colors, so that the city itself is attaining a degree of kind of colorful innovation that is somewhat unprecedented. And I think it's a little unsettling with regards to, the fact that all of a sudden, a street in Harar kind of looks like a rainbow in a way, using these colors that are just, their saturation is so intense that it really just kind of stops you in your tracks. So.
Thanks. I have a few questions from James Westcote, and I will just read through them. The first one is, shrines are sometimes what is left of a larger funerary landscape with surrounding graveyards or of followers, for example, but they're also usually absorbed into the urban fabric more organically. Are such processes happening in Harar Jugol, or is something else happening around these shrines? And then I'll wait for the second question.
No, that's actually a great question. And that's probably something that I should have noted. So many of these shrines are actually part of larger complexes that do incorporate numerous graves of followers. And depending on their age, some are, readily recognizable. The kind of tomb-esque infrastructure is there, whether it's a gravestone, whether it's a demarcated space. In other cases, the markers have in some ways crumbled. And so in many ways, it is completely dependent on kind of local memory or the memory of the caretakers involved in the complex to actually physically be able to point out these sites. And so because of that, in many cases, Harar Jugol as a space is just kind of assumed to contain and kind of benefit from the presence of these just kind of numerous powerful people. And even if one doesn't have a dome or a grave site, there is kind of an underlying assumption that they are present, which also contributes to kind of this underlying idea of Harar Jugol as a shrine, as, kind of every aspect of its space is being kind of spiritually endowed because of the fact that, through their interment, the spirituality of these individuals just kind of permeates the entire atmosphere. So yes, there are a number of spaces that at this point are unmarked. Generally, but this also points to kind of the selection process that seems to be going on, right? So the areas of very well-known saints or saints that are seen as being particularly powerful or relevant to Harar's history are very carefully maintained. They're visited often. They receive a number of donations from disciples who come to visit. Whereas, the ones that may have been followers or kind of lesser saints, they tend to become peripheral so that they are still present and that they are still acknowledged, but not necessarily kind of identified specifically through a physical marker. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. And then the second question from Jim is, in historical terms, shrines are often datable by gravestones and texts that allow one to retrace the historical geography of the city and the changing status of different areas at different times. And have such death dates been studied in the case of Harar? And yes.
So to my knowledge, they have not. And I will say that obviously, depending on the age of the gravestones, they each have various kind of states of erosion. In addition, some of them are carved, some of them are painted. So that's actually a really great question. And that would be just kind of a wonderful project to undertake. To my knowledge, I don't think anybody has done that kind of work. And it would be a significant undertaking given the amount of material that one would need to cover. But I mean, it would be enormously useful towards just kind of understanding the landscape even more.
Would you describe that most of the pilgrims that travel to Harar Jugol are Ethiopian, or are they from the larger, wider Islamic world?
I can't speak to that with a huge degree of knowledge. My understanding is that during kind of the major yearly pilgrimage events, so the Eids, just any number of kind of broad-based kind of Islamic holidays, Harar tends to get a fairly large number of international visitors, international in the sense that many of them travel to Harar from kind of surrounding nations. Generally speaking, though, for kind of these smaller personal pilgrimages, most of those come from individuals who are either in country or just kind of in the countries that are kind of closest to Harar. So, you have a number of people coming over from Somalia and some other spaces that are nearby. Yeah, I will also say too that so traditionally, the Islam that most Harari inhabitants have practiced is Qadari Sufism. One individual I talked to actually said that in recent years, there have been a number of kind of more orthodox kind of Muslims actually coming into Harar, and there have been some noises against kind of the performative spirituality associated with these shrines as kind of being a form of kind of inappropriate privileging of kind of these material objects. So these are also conversations that are increasingly going on in the space as well.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. if anybody has any final questions, I had one of my own, but please enter them in the Q&A section. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more, and we have to wrap up quick soon, but if you could talk a little bit more about your process of traveling and doing fieldwork in Harar, Jugol, and what that looked like, especially if it was recently. Thanks.
Yeah, so a lot of this research happened about 2 years ago. I was on sabbatical, and I actually spent my sabbatical in South Africa, which was kind of a convenient platform to go up. It was, and with regards to my research process, one of the things that I think is so important, and it's something that I try to do, whether or not I am successful or not, is I try to be very, very aware of my particular position with regards to kind of the spaces that I'm allowed to enter and the people that I'm allowed to interact with. So I am American, I am white, I identify as cis, I am agnostic. So, all of these things are very large kind of preventative elements that, have the very real possibility of kind of biasing a lot of my interpretations. And and so along these lines, one of the things that I really try to do when I engage with people or when I'm allowed to enter these spaces is I try as much as I can not to impose myself on them. I try to as much as I can allow the spaces and the people who agree to talk to me speak for themselves, and I try to be as honest and authentic with regards to how I represent them as possible. And so along these lines, with regards to Harar, I went through kind of a colleague's friend who actually lives in Harar. And with him, I went around and introduced myself. I spent probably about, I think, maybe 6 weeks in the space. I went and introduced myself to the family custodians of all the shrines that I wanted to cover. I took down names. I asked for permission to photograph. I made donations to the shrines themselves. I also dressed appropriately. I covered my hair. And just really trying to take as much time as I possibly could to engage in a kind of respectful observation of the city, the people, the shrines, the mosques, in a way that was both unobtrusive and just kind of sensitive to my position as just kind of a fundamental outsider looking in. And on top of that, there were spaces that I was not allowed to go into, and that was fine. But I will say too, and this is maybe something to take away for anybody who's doing research like this, is sometimes you can learn just as much about a space by not going in as you can going in. Because by not going into some of these spaces, I was completely reliant on the narratives that other people were giving me about them. And in so many ways that enabled me to privilege their voices, probably more than I ever would have on my own. And that actually resulted in me, in the spaces I could go in, subsequently kind of buttressing my feelings with people, who spent every day in there. So, generally speaking, that is my kind of iterative process. It is something that will continuously be in a state of evolution, with the hopes that, I do justice to the space and to the people who are nice enough to let me be present.
Thank you so much. I think that's the end of the talk and the question and answer session. I just wanted to congratulate you again on your lecture. It was beautiful, and I really enjoyed listening. So congratulations and welcome to AKPI at MIT family. Thank you, Nasser, as well. Nasser has, I think, a few housekeeping notes as we leave. So I'll turn it over to Nasser. Thanks so much again, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. And thank you, Michelle. Thank you for a wonderful lecture and for entertaining all these questions. We are very privileged to have you with us. And I would like to announce our next speaker, which will be on Monday, May the 10th at 6 p.m., same time, same place, same virtual place. And our next speaker is Professor Shaden Tajeldin, who is an associate professor of cultural studies and comparative literature at the University of Minnesota, and whose talk will be entitled "The Place of Africa in Theory." I hope to see you all there, and have a very wonderful evening. Thank you all, and good night. And thank you, Michelle, again.